Have you ever woken up at night with the unsettling feeling that you're not alone? I'd heard of people feeling watched before, but until that night, I never truly understood it. It was around 3 a.m. when I was jolted awake by a sensation that I couldn't shake. Someone was staring at me. I glanced around, my room dark and quiet, but as I turned my head toward the window, I saw it. A figure outside, standing impossibly still, watching me. At first I thought it was a trick of the light or maybe a passing shadow, but the longer I looked, the clearer it became. A face, obscured but unmistakably human, pressed close against the glass, staring right at me. My initial fear turned to panic when I noticed something disturbing. The figure wasn't on the ground, it was hovering, eye level with my second-story window. Every hair on my body stood on end as I realized that this person, if it even was a person, shouldn't have been able to reach that height. I closed my eyes, telling myself it was a nightmare, that it would go away. But when I dared to open them again, the figure was closer, its face pressed hard against the window, lips moving soundlessly as if whispering. I fumbled for my phone to call the police, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. As soon as I hit call, the figure disappeared. No fading, no stepping back, just gone. The dispatcher on the other end sounded unimpressed by my story, but I couldn't let it go. I stayed up until dawn, only daring to check outside when daylight finally broke. When I went downstairs and opened the front door, I found footprints, muddy, barefoot prints, leading from my window around the house. But the thing that made my blood run cold? The tracks stopped in the middle of my yard abruptly, as if whoever, or whatever it was, had simply vanished into thin air. I checked my security camera footage, desperate for some proof. When I played it back, my heart nearly stopped. The figure appeared, drifting up toward my window as if gravity didn't apply. It paused, hovering for hours, staring, waiting. And just before it disappeared, the camera glitched, showing what looked like its hand reaching through the glass, almost touching my sleeping face. Have you ever heard your own name whispered in a voice that shouldn't exist? I kept an old clock radio next to my bed, a relic from my childhood, with dials that clicked and spun like they'd seen decades. I never really used it, but one night it flickered on by itself, its static hissing through the room, and through the static I heard my name. I froze, trying to rationalize it away, but then it repeated, drawn out, like someone trying to speak to me directly from inside the radio. I convinced myself it was a glitch, but the next night it happened again, louder this time. The voice grew distorted, almost angry, and it wasn't just calling my name anymore. It was talking, saying things only I knew. Secrets I'd never told anyone. My hands were shaking as I reached to turn it off, but before I could, I heard one final phrase: turn around. The next morning I shared the incident with my roommate, who looked disturbed and admitted that the same thing had happened to her with her own radio, down to the same words. We didn't want to believe it, but we were terrified. So we checked the security footage from our rooms, desperate for an answer. When we replayed the video, both of us sat in horror. Just after midnight, each of our radios flickered on simultaneously. Standing at the edge of my bed was a shadowy figure watching. The footage glitched, then skipped to my roommate's room, where the same figure leaned over her bed, almost as if whispering in her ear. Just before it disappeared, it turned to look directly into the camera with hollow, dark eyes, as if daring us to watch. The footage ended with both radios turning off at the exact same time. That was 3 weeks ago. Every night since, we've both woken up at exactly 3 a.m. to the sound of static. Have you ever had someone knock on your door late at night, only to find no one there? This happened to me last month. It was around midnight when I heard a slow, steady knock on my door. I froze, not expecting anyone, and when I looked through the peephole, no one was there. I brushed it off as a prank, maybe a neighborhood kid, but as soon as I settled back into bed, the knock came again, louder this time. When I opened the door, a man stood there, a stranger with a vacant stare holding an old, torn envelope. He asked if Mrs. Hastings lived there. I told him he must have the wrong place. No one by that name had ever lived there as far as I knew. His face went blank and he whispered, "But she's waiting inside," before turning and walking down the hall, disappearing into the dark stairwell. For the next few nights, I barely slept. The knock started again, each time louder and more desperate. On the third night, I was fed up and left my door slightly open, daring him to return. At 3 a.m., I heard the knock and stormed into the hall, but it was empty. The envelope was there, lying on my welcome mat. Inside was a photo of a woman who looked eerily like me, labeled Mrs. Hastings. Have you ever been watched so closely it felt like they knew your every thought? After moving into my new apartment, strange whispers started coming from the unit next door, almost like someone was having a conversation about me. I brushed it off at first, thinking it was just thin walls, but then they started saying things no one else should know, details about my life, things I'd never shared. One night, I decided to record the whispers to prove to myself I wasn't imagining it. When I played it back, I could hear someone repeating my name over and over, but then it changed into something darker. "We're here for you." I haven't seen or heard anyone go in or out of that apartment, yet every night the whispers grow louder until it feels like they're coming from every wall in my room, like the apartment itself is alive, watching me, waiting for me to break. What if your next delivery order was your last? I've been a delivery driver for years, but nothing prepared me for the night I got an order from an address that didn't exist. The GPS insisted I go down an old dirt road deep in the woods, even though no house was visible. When I arrived, a woman was waiting, dressed in clothes from a different era, like she'd stepped out of another time. She reached out, asking if I'd come to stay. When I tried to leave, my car wouldn't start, and my phone had no signal. She whispered that everyone who comes here is meant to stay, and then everything went dark. Hours later, I was back on the main road, but my car showed signs of a crash. My manager later said I'd been missing for 3 days, though I swear I'd only been gone for an hour. Now, every time I get a late-night delivery, I wonder if it's a call to return to the place I was never meant to leave. Would you ever sleep above a basement that watches you? When my friend moved into an old family estate, we discovered that the basement had been locked for decades with strict warnings never to enter. But after hearing faint noises at night, we decided to go down there. The basement was covered in strange symbols, with candles arranged in what looked like a ritual. In the middle of the room, we found a trapdoor that wasn't on any floor plan, leading further down into the earth. When we opened it, we heard faint voices calling my friend's name. Then we found a family record, names of those who had mysteriously died in the house, each crossed out. The last name, my friend's. Suddenly we heard footsteps above us, though no one else was supposed to be there. As we tried to leave, the basement door slammed shut, and the voices grew louder, chanting my friend's name as if they were calling him to join the others whose names had been crossed out. Have you ever stayed somewhere that felt off, like you were being watched even in the dead of night? While on a business trip, I arrived late at a historic hotel, eager to crash. They handed me a key to room 713, but when I got to the 7th floor, I couldn't find it. There was no room 713. The sequence skipped from 712 to 714. Confused, I returned to the front desk, and after a quiet discussion among themselves, the staff gave me a different room key, telling me to stay clear of 713. Of course, curiosity got the better of me. Around midnight, I snuck out to find it. Strangely, I found a narrow door in the spot where room 713 should have been, but it was cold to the touch and heavily padlocked. I heard faint whispers and, chillingly, the sound of someone tapping from the inside. Later that night, unable to shake the experience, I looked up the hotel's history. That's when I found an article from years back. A woman had been murdered in 713 and was never seen leaving the room. They'd locked it up ever since. But as I was reading, I saw my room key, somehow changed back to 713. I packed and left immediately, never looking back, but every now and then, I swear I still hear the faint tapping as if it's following me. Would you visit a place that seems to call people back, even if it meant risking your sanity? My friends and I spent summers exploring an abandoned mental hospital deep in the woods. There was a strange rumor: if you entered the main building, someone, or something, would follow you home. We laughed it off, daring each other to explore every inch of it. Years later, after moving far from that town, I started noticing odd things in my home. Scratches on the walls and lights flickering late at night. Once I spotted something in my peripheral vision, a figure that seemed to retreat as soon as I turned. Thinking I was just overtired, I brushed it off, until one evening when I heard someone whisper my name in the darkness. I knew I was alone, yet there it was, echoing through the silence. I reached out to old friends, and one after another, they admitted they'd experienced something similar since our time in those woods. Whatever followed us home, it never left. Now, we're trapped in an invisible cage with something that watches us, waiting, and we can only wonder if it will ever stop. In a quiet call center, a late-night shift turns into a nightmare. An agent, Sandra, begins receiving bizarre calls from an unknown number. At first it sounds like radio static, but it soon shifts to a voice whispering desperate pleas for help. Come to me. Find me. When Sandra hangs up, the line immediately rings again, each call more frantic. She tries blocking the number, but it keeps bypassing the system. Sandra traces the address given by the voice and discovers it's connected to an old farmhouse abandoned since the 1950s. Rumor has it the house belonged to a family who mysteriously disappeared. After reluctantly driving to the site, she feels a force pulling her toward an old well behind the house. Digging around, she finds something wrapped in cloth, a tattered diary revealing that the family didn't disappear. They were buried alive by their own father, who had heard voices. Twist. The final line of the diary stops Sandra cold. If anyone finds this, know that I am Sandra. He buried me, and I never left. She realizes she's holding her own diary, and the final call isn't from someone else. It's her own voice calling out to herself. A young man, Ryan, starts hearing faint scratching beneath his bed every night. Dismissing it as pests, he's startled to hear faint whispering along with the scratching. When he checks, nothing's there, but the sounds persist, growing louder each night and leaving scratches on his bedroom floor. Desperate, he installs a camera to catch the culprit. The footage reveals a shadow figure crawling out from under his bed and standing over him as he sleeps. Horrified, he learns from previous tenants that a similar entity haunted them too, an entity that seemed to feed on their fear and only appeared during moments of complete vulnerability. As he digs deeper, he realizes each previous tenant either vanished or died under mysterious circumstances. On the last night, Ryan wakes up to find himself paralyzed, unable to move. From the shadows, a figure that looks exactly like him emerges from under the bed, smirking. As Ryan's vision fades, he hears his own voice whisper, "You were never the original." When police arrive days later, they find only one person, a man claiming to be Ryan, but with no memory of the life he left behind. Imagine being an Uber driver on an ordinary night shift, only to pick up a passenger who is anything but ordinary. A driver in a small town accepts a late-night request from an old church, a place with a dark history, rumored to be haunted. As he pulls up, he notices the passenger isn't standing outside, but is already seated in the back, facing away. When he glances in the mirror, he can't see the passenger's face, only a shadow. The passenger remains silent, no matter how much he tries to make conversation. But as they near the destination, the passenger speaks one cryptic line: "I just need a ride back to my grave." The driver tries to laugh it off, but feels an overwhelming sense of dread. After dropping the passenger off and driving away, he receives a notification. No passenger was ever picked up. A later search reveals that every driver who's taken a ride from that church has disappeared, never seen again. Days later, the driver's own family can't recognize him, claiming he seems like a stranger in his own home. In a remote village, there's a tradition that on the night of a blood moon, children dare each other to play the mirror game. The rules are simple. Sit in front of a mirror at midnight, light a candle, and ask the mirror to reveal your soul. Most see nothing and laugh it off, but one young girl, against warnings, takes the dare and is never the same. The next morning, her family finds her staring blankly, claiming her reflection talks to her, asking her to switch places. The family brushes it off until they notice her reflection seems to move slightly out of sync, with a chilling smile that grows each day. The girl becomes increasingly withdrawn, eventually disappearing without a trace. Months later, she's found, but in the reflection of a mirror, alive yet unable to escape, a prisoner of her own dare. A man moves into a seemingly perfect old house with spacious rooms and charming vintage details. The realtor only warned him of occasional sounds, which he attributed to the old plumbing. But on the first night, he hears faint whispers, a woman's voice repeating his name, pleading for help. He searches the house but finds nothing. Each night, the voice grows louder, following him from room to room, until he realizes it's coming from inside the walls. Desperate, he pries open a section, revealing a sealed-off stairway that leads to an underground room. The room contains a mirror where he sees himself, older and skeletal, banging on the glass from the other side, pleading with his reflection to let him out. A mother buys her young daughter a vintage doll from a flea market, unaware of its history. The doll appears normal at first, but soon strange things start happening. The mother wakes in the middle of the night to the sound of a child crying. When she checks on her daughter, she's fast asleep. The crying persists, always at 3 a.m., and she starts noticing tear stains on the doll's face. After researching, she discovers the doll once belonged to a little girl who went missing under mysterious circumstances. Fearing for her daughter, the mother tries to get rid of it, but the doll always finds its way back, now showing a sinister smile. The mother realizes the doll's face is changing each night, taking on the likeness of her daughter. The patient in room 314. In a quiet, understaffed hospital, the graveyard shift is usually uneventful, until room 314 is mentioned. The room is infamous among staff for the patient, a figure known to appear when someone is close to death. While no one officially acknowledges it, there are whispers among the nurses of strange, unexplainable phenomena whenever room 314 is occupied. One night, a new nurse, Amy, hears rumors about room 314 but dismisses them as a hazing prank. Then one evening, she's assigned to a critical patient in room 314, an elderly woman who seems paranoid and refuses to be left alone. As Amy attends to her, the woman suddenly grabs her arm and with wide, fearful eyes whispers, "He's coming. Do you see him?" Amy is disturbed but plays it off until the woman points to the darkened corner of the room, her hand trembling. Amy glances over, seeing nothing at first, but then she notices a tall, shadowy figure standing in the corner. A man in an outdated, faded suit with an unsettling grin. Amy blinks, and he's gone. She writes it off as sleep deprivation, but that's just the beginning. Throughout her shift, the lights in 314 flicker monitors glitch and the air feels colder every time she enters the room. Each nurse assigned to 314 insists they've seen the patient, all describing him with the same haunting details. As Amy's shift progresses, she begins hearing footsteps behind her whispers that seem to follow her even into other rooms. At dawn, she enters 314 one last time, only to find the bed empty. Panicked, she calls security, but they insist no one was ever checked into that room that night. As she signs out, she looks at the patient list for the evening and notices her own name next to room 314. The last entry simply reads, "Transferred to him." If these chilling stories of live broadcast deaths gave you the creeps, make sure to like and subscribe for more eerie and mysterious tales. And if you're curious to know what happens at IHOP after midnight, click the video on the screen now. It's a story you won't believe. Don't forget to check the playlist in the top left for even more spine-tingling stories.